The beacon was never supposed to reach them. I want to say that plainly before I say anything else, because the version that spread through the conclave in the weeks afterward, the version that had us deliberately petitioning Earth, deliberately invoking some ancient mutual recognition clause, deliberately playing a long diplomatic game while our ship burned, that version is wrong. It flatters us. The truth is simpler and considerably more embarrassing. Oren Teshali, our communications second, was 26 years old. She had been awake for 31 consecutive hours. She misread a routing table. She punched the beacon into the pre-diaspora burst channel instead of the modern coalition emergency band, and the signal went out the wrong door entirely. What answered us was not what she was trying to reach. I am Veth Karas. I was the captain of the colony transport Unbroken Meridian on the day we activated the beacon. I was also, as of 12 minutes before activation, a captain who had lost a third of her portside hull plating to a debris field we had no business transiting, and whose colony complement of 941 passengers was sealed into every aft compartment we had, breathing recycled air through ducts that were, at that point, still marginal. Not good. Marginal. I was making calculations about how long marginal lasted. Let me be precise about what marginal meant that day. The portside breach had compromised 2 atmospheric processing units and put a third into failover mode. Failover mode means the unit is technically functioning, but at reduced throughput, running a protocol designed for emergencies that are measured in hours rather than days. We had 941 people drawing on an atmospheric system that was now running at approximately 68% of standard capacity. The math was not complicated. At current draw, I had roughly 11 hours before the aft compartments moved from marginal to concerning. At concerning, the passengers most vulnerable to oxygen stress, children under 4, adults over 60, anyone with a compromised respiratory system, would begin to show symptoms. At 10 hours after concerning, the general population would begin to show symptoms. I did not share these numbers with anyone except Seville. Seville is my first officer. She has the same information I have, always, that is non-negotiable, and she was making the same calculations. We did not discuss them at length. We knew what they said. We spent our energy on things we could affect. I was also trying to keep Oren functional, because Oren was the only person on my comms console who could maintain the burst transmitter at all. Our primary communications officer, Derek, had a compression fracture in both legs from the impact that had taken out the hull plating. He had been on the port corridor when the breach happened, and the pressure event had slammed him into a bulkhead joint with enough force to crack both tibias cleanly. He was sedated in the medical bay. He was going to be fine. He was not going to be at his console for the foreseeable future. So Oren stayed at the console. She was second-tier qualified on the transmitter, which meant she could operate it competently under normal conditions. She had been at the console through the breach event, through the emergency sealing of the aft compartments, through the initial damage assessment, and through the 4-hour period in which we were attempting to determine the full scope of the hull failure. 31 hours awake by the time we activated the beacon. She was functional. She was not at her best. She misread the routing table. The pre-diaspora burst channel and the coalition emergency band occupy adjacent sections of our transmitter's protocol menu. Adjacent in the menu because they are adjacent in the frequency register, maintained as legacy entries alongside the modern channels for reasons that made sense to whoever designed the protocol tree and are simply facts of the interface now. She selected the wrong line. She transmitted the beacon. She came back to her monitoring screen, and she began watching the coalition emergency band for a response. The response never came on that band. I did not know any of this for 7 hours. For the first 6 hours, I genuinely believed we were waiting for a coalition rescue tender. Their response time to a hull breach distress signal in our sector was historically between 4 and 8 hours. 4 hours, I told myself. We were at the 4-hour end. The coalition was efficient. The coalition had resources staged throughout this sector because this was a high-transit corridor. The tender would arrive, they would assess the hull, they would bring a repressurization crew, and we would be on our way. I made rounds during those 6 hours. The aft compartments, all of them. Aft compartment 7 had the largest number of children aboard, 43 children under the age of 8, with their parents and guardians, packed into a space designed for 60 passengers as a comfortable sleeping configuration. They had converted it into something between a campsite and a waiting room. Some of the parents had pulled mattresses from the bunks and arranged them in clusters so families could stay together. A few of the older children had organized a card game in the center of the space with the gravity boots they'd been given for the transit. The youngest children were in laps, or sleeping, or quietly examining the ceiling with the patients. Very small children sometimes have for situations they do not fully understand. A woman named Dara, who had 4 children with her and whose face showed what 6 hours of uncertainty looks like on a parent, stopped me near the door. She asked me what the situation was. I told her we had a hull breach, that the aft compartments were sealed as a precaution while we completed repairs, that we had a rescue response inbound, and that I expected the situation to resolve without significant additional impact on our transit schedule. All of that was true, or was true in the version I was operating under at the time. She asked me if her children were safe. I told her they were safe. That was also true, in the time frame I had at that moment. She looked at me for a moment, the long, assessing look of a person who has been told things by people in authority before and has developed a good sense of whether the person in authority is telling the full truth or a carefully selected portion of it. Then she said, "Okay," and she went back to her children. I made the same rounds in 3 other aft compartments. Similar conversations, different faces. A retired academic named Borthas who kept asking me very specific questions about atmospheric processing unit throughput that he shouldn't have known to ask, and that I deflected with the care that the situation required. A young couple traveling with an elderly parent who was already showing some color in her face that I noted and did not comment on, because commenting would require explaining what I was noting. And Tarek was already monitoring that situation from the medical bay by remote sensor. A group of 7 adults traveling together, who had collectively decided that the best response to the uncertainty was to sleep, and who were all asleep in a row when I came through, which I found both admirable and slightly unnerving. I went to aft compartment 2 on the way back to the bridge. Compartment 2 had the medical cases. 3 passengers who had boarded with documented respiratory conditions, mild, all of them, nothing that would have flagged as a transit risk under standard conclave guidelines, but documented. Tarek had them on remote monitoring. I checked in on them personally because Tarek was stretched thin, and because sometimes the fact of the captain appearing in the compartment tells people something that no remote monitoring can convey. The first, a man named Sareth who was older than most passengers on a colony transit, had the particular calm of someone who had decided some time ago to stop spending energy on things he could not directly affect. He told me he was comfortable. He asked me, with genuine curiosity rather than anxiety, what the atmospheric processing failover rate was for our current system configuration. I told him I wasn't going to give him that number. He said, "Fair enough." He did not push. He had the quality of a person who has accepted the limits of the information he will receive from people whose job requires them to hold some of it back. The second and third were a bonded pair, traveling together to the same colony parcel, who were holding hands across the gap between their bunks. They didn't ask me anything. They looked at me when I came in and I told them the situation was being managed, and they nodded, and one of them said, "We heard you say that in the last compartment." I said, "It's true in this one too." They accepted that. I came back to the bridge at the 5-hour mark. Seville gave me a look. The look said, "Still nothing." I sat in my chair. I looked at the scope. The sector was clear, no coalition tender, no signals, no response traffic. I told myself we were at the high end of the Fortway Tower window. The tender was coming. We were fine. At hour 6, Seville said quietly, "The primary processing unit in the failover sequence is showing a micro-oscillation." I looked at the board. She was right. It was a small oscillation. The unit was compensating, adjusting, doing what failover mode is designed to do. But micro-oscillations in failover mode, sustained over time, can precede a more significant failure event. Not always. Sometimes they stabilize, but the direction the oscillation was moving was not the direction associated with stabilization. I recalculated. My 11-hour margin became 9 hours, maybe 8.5. I did not say this out loud. It was Oren who saw the response first. She was still at the console, still running diagnostics on our transmitter to make sure the beacon was still broadcasting cleanly, and the signal that came back at hour 7 was not on the transmitter band she was monitoring. It was on the pre-diaspora burst channel. It came in as a ping on a channel she had used to send the beacon, and then had been monitoring only peripherally, because she expected the response on the coalition band. And then it came through, and she stared at it for a moment, and then she translated it manually, because her auto-translate matrix wasn't synced for the dialect of Earth Standard COM protocols embedded in the response header. She walked to my chair. She stood beside me. She said very quietly, "Captain, we have a response. It's not the coalition." I looked at her. She showed me the translation on her data slate. 3 words. "Heading your way." I want to describe what I felt in that moment, but I am not sure I have words for it that would satisfy anyone who wasn't there. We were a colony ship. We were not a military vessel. We were not anything that would justify what those 3 words implied about the entity that had sent them. We had 941 passengers in our aft compartments. We had a hull that was borderline. I had been running calculations about marginal air recycling for 6 hours, and those calculations had become more precise and less comfortable in the last hour. And then a civilization that we had never hailed, that we had not petitioned, that we had not contacted in any deliberate way, sent us 3 words that implied they were already moving. Heading your way. I asked Oren to confirm the transmission point. She confirmed it. It was Earth's nearest sector relay. The signal had gone out on a frequency Earth maintained for historical reasons that predated the current conclave structure by several centuries. A frequency they had apparently kept live, apparently kept staffed, apparently kept ready, on the theory that if the channel was open, someone might eventually use it. We had used it by accident. They had answered inside 3 minutes of receipt. I asked Oren what she had sent them exactly. She showed me the log. The beacon was standard distress format, hull breach, life support marginal, 941 souls aboard, coordinates accurate, no military action requested, standard colony transport identification. She had sent an accurate description of our situation. The only thing she had done wrong was the channel. Everything else was correct. I asked her to respond to the relay. I told her to identify us as the colony transport Unbroken Meridian, to confirm our situation had not changed, and to ask politely, I said, very politely, what assets were inbound. The response came back in 11 minutes. It was longer this time. It was a formatted asset dispatch list in Earth Standard COM protocol, translated by our system into Conclave Standard 4, and I read it twice before I was confident I understood what I was looking at. Forward carrier Tenacious Will. Hospital ship Meridian Grace. I noted, with a kind of detached recognition, that the hospital ship shared a root word with my own ship's name, which felt either meaningful or purely coincidental, and I elected to treat it as coincidental. Destroyer screen, 4 vessels, designation 9th Armada Group. Estimated arrival, 43 minutes. 43 minutes. I sat with that for a moment. The coalition emergency tender I had been expecting would have arrived in 4 to 8 hours, and it would have been one tender. A repressurization crew, a basic medical team, a tow capacity. That would have been appropriate. That would have been proportionate to our situation. I would have been grateful for it. The thing that was inbound to our position right now was not a tender. It was not proportionate. It was not, if I am honest, a response that matched the scale of what we had sent on that beacon. I called my first officer, Seville, to the bridge. She stood next to me and read the dispatch list. She read it twice as I had. Then she said, "Are they sure they have the right ship?" I told her I had confirmed twice. They had the right ship. She said, "That's a carrier." I told her yes. She said, "We sent a civilian beacon." I told her I was aware. She looked at the dispatch list for another moment, then she looked at me, and something in her expression had the quality of a person who is reassessing a large number of assumptions simultaneously. She said, "Do we need to tell them we're not a military vessel?" I had already sent that clarification in my second response. They had acknowledged it. They were still coming. I told Seville to make sure the aft compartments knew we had a response, without specifying the nature of the response. I wanted to keep the passengers calm. A carrier group inbound to a civilian colony ship was not, inherently, calming information, even if the carrier group was friendly. Especially if the carrier group was friendly. There is something about the scale of the response that can produce its own particular category of unease. A sense that whatever they think is happening here must be much worse than what you believe is happening here. I went back to my hull readings. We were still marginal. The micro-oscillation in the failover unit was not worsening, which I told myself was a positive indicator. The port side was holding. The aft compartments were cycling. I had at this point 7 months of colony administration on my record and 11 years of transport piloting before that, and I was sitting in a captain's chair doing arithmetic on air recycling rates and thinking about the fact that in 43 minutes, now 39 minutes, a carrier was going to drop out of transit in my sector, and I was going to have to explain to whoever hailed me that I had sent a beacon on the wrong channel. I started composing that explanation in my head. It did not get more comfortable with rehearsal. At T-minus 22 minutes, Oren flagged another signal. It was a hail direct, not a relay response. Voice channel encoded but Earth standard. She put it through our translator and it came back clean. The voice was a woman's. It was calm. It had the particular quality of calm that belongs to people who are paid to remain calm in situations that would not produce calmness in unpaid people. She identified herself as Commander Ansa Vale, Flight Operations, Forward Carrier Tenacious Will, 9th Armada Group, Black Armada Registry. She said they were 17 minutes out. She said their medical team was already prepped and she was requesting a passenger manifest and a structural integrity report so they could stage the transfer properly. She did not ask whether we had meant to send the beacon to them. She did not ask for an explanation of how we had ended up on the pre-diaspora burst channel. She did not ask anything that suggested she found our situation unusual, which was either an act of professional courtesy or a genuine absence of curiosity, and I could not tell which. I told Oren to transmit the manifest and the structural report. We had both ready. I also asked Oren to patch me through on the voice channel because I felt it was appropriate that I speak to Commander Vale directly. Oren patched me through. I introduced myself. I confirmed our situation. I thanked Commander Vale for the response time, which I said was, I searched for the right word, remarkable. She said, "It's what we do." I said, "Commander, I want to be transparent with you. We did not aim the beacon at your network. We were attempting to reach the coalition emergency band. Our communications officer made a routing error. I want to make sure you have that information." There was a pause, not a long pause, perhaps 2 seconds. Commander Vale said, "We received a valid distress beacon with 941 souls aboard. The channel it came on is one we monitor. We are inbound." I said, "I understand. I simply wanted to ensure you weren't operating under a misapprehension." She said, "Captain Karras, are your passengers in danger?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Then we don't have a misapprehension. We have a beacon and a ship that needs help. We'll be there in 15 minutes. She closed the channel. I sat with that for a moment too. Seville, who had been listening from beside my chair, said, "She didn't sound bothered." I told Seville that she had not. Seville said, "Should we be worried about what it means that this is normal to them?" I told Seville I was choosing not to worry about that right now. The 14 minutes that followed were the longest 14 minutes of my life, which is a statement I recognize sounds excessive given that I had already spent 7 hours doing arithmetic about air recycling. But waiting is different from calculating. Calculating gives you something to do with your hands. Waiting is pure duration. At T-0, Oren said, "Captain, transit signature." I looked at my scope. I want to describe this carefully, because I think it matters that the description be accurate. There is a transit signature, the way a ship announces itself when it drops from faster than standard travel into normal space. The signature scales with the mass of the object transitioning. A courier drone leaves a signature that is barely distinguishable from background radiation noise. A standard transport like ours leaves a signature that registers clearly across several thousand kilometers and fades within a few minutes. A carrier leaves a signature that you feel in the unbroken meridian superstructure. Not violently, not enough to alarm passengers, but enough that Seville looked up from her console and put her hand flat on the navigation board, the way you do when the ship tells you something through the hull rather than through the instruments. The 9th Armada Group came out of transit in formation, staggered, precise, the kind of formation that exists not to be threatening, but because maintaining geometry in transit entry is simply good practice, and the kind of people who do this for a living do it correctly without thinking about it. The carrier came out first. It was, "I am going to tell you what I know about carrier dimensions in the Conclave's own registry, and let you do the comparison yourself." The tenacious will was, by Conclave registry standards for military capital ships, at the large end of what we would classify as a fleet carrier. It was not the largest human military vessel in the registry. It was considerably larger than anything that should have shown up at a civilian colony transport's distress call. My scope returned its silhouette and mass reading, and then took an additional half-second to confirm the classification, as if the system itself needed a moment to reconcile what it was seeing with what it had reason to expect. The tenacious will's hull caught the sector light cleanly. It was dayside relative to the local star, running lights cycling in the standard approach pattern, and the sheer geometric scale of it against the backdrop of empty space produced the particular cognitive dissonance that comes from knowing intellectually that something is large, and then encountering it visually, and discovering that intellectual knowledge was insufficient preparation. The hospital ship came out second, off the carrier's port side, Meridian Grace. White and gray hull markings, the large Red Cross variant that Earth uses for medical vessels, running lights on a distinct frequency that our system automatically identified and flagged as non-combatant. A hospital ship. A full hospital ship, designed for theater of operations medical support, which in practical terms meant it had surgical capacity, trauma bays, a rehabilitation wing, and beds for more patients than we had passengers. The 4 destroyers came out in a loose diamond screen, and each of them was larger than our ship. Oren said very quietly, "They brought a lot." I said, "Yes." She said, "For us." I said, "Apparently." She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "I sent the beacon to the wrong channel." I said, "I know." She said, "I made a mistake." I said, "Oren." "Yes, and 941 people are currently watching a carrier group decelerate toward our position. Let's think about that for a moment before we decide how to characterize what happened. She was quiet. The carrier hailed us. Commander Vale again. Voice channel. She told me they were going to match our velocity and hold position off our port side, the damaged side, to give their engineering team a direct visual assessment of the breach. She told me the hospital ship would position off our starboard side, and that they were requesting permission to begin transfer of medical personnel to our vessel to begin initial triage of our passenger complement. She told me their engineering lead would want to communicate directly with my chief engineer within the next 10 minutes to plan the hull stabilization and whether a patch job was viable at our position or whether we needed to be towed. She said all of this the way someone would read a logistics checklist, not unkindly, not without care, with a thoroughness that suggested she had done this kind of work before in conditions that were probably worse than ours, and that the thoroughness was itself the care. I granted all of it. Over the next 40 minutes, the following things happened. A shuttle from the Tenacious will made 2 runs to our port hull with an engineering team, carrying equipment I did not have the technical vocabulary to name precisely, but which my chief engineer, Brell, described afterward as considerably more than we would need and exactly what we needed. Brell has a way of talking about engineering problems that strips them down to their essential components. She assessed what the human engineers brought with the focused, somewhat unnerving attention she gives to any piece of hardware she hasn't encountered before. The attention that means she is already working out how it functions, what its tolerances are, and whether she agrees with the design decisions. She looked at what the human engineers brought and she said that, and then she got to work alongside them. I learned later, from Brell, some of what the engineering team had brought that she had not had technical vocabulary for in the moment. A hull sealant application system that used a micro-injected structural polymer in a different formulation than the coalition standard patch compound, faster curing time, better bonding characteristics at the molecular level with our hull alloy composition, and a delivery mechanism that could be applied to curved hull sections without the staging scaffold that coalition standard patches require. The lead human engineer, a compact woman named Voss, who communicated with Brell in the clipped shorthand of 2 people who have decided that understanding the problem is more interesting than explaining themselves to observers, had run a preliminary assessment of our hull section in 11 minutes and told Brell exactly what the application sequence would be. Brell had asked 3 questions. Voss had answered them. Brell had said, "All right." That was the entire discussion. They had been working in near silence since. Medical personnel from the Meridian Grace came aboard in 2 waves. The first wave was triage, 4 people with equipment that could assess 941 passengers in a systematic way that, frankly, our own medical officer had not had the personnel to manage. The second wave was treatment. What they found in triage was that our passengers had been breathing recycled air at marginally degraded quality for 7 hours, and that this had produced in the more vulnerable members of our complement, the elderly, the young children, several passengers with existing respiratory conditions, early indicators of oxygen stress. Not critical, marginal as I had assessed, but moving toward concerning in a timeline that I had been calculating. The elderly woman with the color in her face that Tarek had been monitoring remotely, the one traveling with the young couple in aft compartment 3. She was the first the triage team flagged. Her oxygen saturation had dropped 4 points over the previous 2 hours, which matched my projections and also matched the projections I had been hoping were wrong. The Grace's medical team treated her in the compartment with a portable oxygen supplementation unit and a pharmacological intervention that Tarek observed and then described to me later as not a technique we use, but effective. She was sitting upright and talking to her family within 40 minutes of the first treatment dose. Dara's youngest child, the one under 4, the triage team flagged her too. Early indicators treatable, not progressed. The treatment was simpler, supplemental oxygen flow in the immediate compartment space, a monitoring patch. Dara watched them work with the stillness of a parent who is being very carefully controlled. After they cleared her daughter, she sat down on the floor of the compartment and put her face in her hands for about 30 seconds. Then she put her face back up and began talking to her other children as if nothing had happened. They treated it all, in the aft compartments without moving patients, using equipment they had brought in their second wave. My medical officer, Tarek, watched them work and said afterward very little. I found him later in the corridor outside the aft compartments with an expression I did not immediately know how to read. I asked him if he was all right. He said yes. He said, "They brought enough to treat a battalion." I asked him if that was a problem. He said, "No, it's just a number that requires some adjustment." I told him the adjustment was probably worth making. He looked at me with an expression that said he was already making it. Brell's assessment of the hull came back at the 90-minute mark. The pre-diaspora burst channel, I note the irony that the channel Oren had routed us onto, was now the channel I was using for all communications with the 9th Armada Group, because it was the channel they were monitoring, and it was the channel we were now coordinating on. The channel carried Brell's assessment in her flat, precise way. She said the breach was repairable in place. She said the human engineering team had brought a hull sealant application system she had not previously encountered, and that it was, in her assessment, faster and more structurally sound than the coalition standard patch method. She said they had already begun staging the application. She said we would not need a tow. She said she estimated 6 hours to full structural restoration. 6 hours. We had been drifting and calculating for 7. In 6 more hours, we would be structurally restored and ready to continue our transit. She also said, at the end of the assessment, with the tone she uses when she is including information she considers professionally relevant but personally difficult to admit, the failover oscillation would have become a failure event inside 3 hours. The Grace's engineering team identified it independently and corrected it in the first 40 minutes. I did not ask them to look at it. They found it. I said, "That's a good thing, Brell." She said, "Yes, it is. I'm including it in the record." She closed the channel. Seville stood next to me on the bridge and did not say anything for a long time. I asked her what she was thinking. She said, "I'm trying to figure out how to log this." I told her to log it accurately. She said, "The accurate log is going to read like something I made up." I told her to log it anyway. She looked at the scope, where the carrier was holding steady off our port quarter, and the hospital ship off our starboard, and the 4 destroyers in their screen, all of them maintaining position with the kind of precision that bespoke either very good automated systems or very experienced crew, probably both. She said, "They sent all of this because we sent a beacon on the wrong channel." I said, "They sent all of this because we sent a beacon. The channel was incidental." She said, "They maintain a channel that nobody else monitors. They staff it. They answer it in 3 minutes. That's not incidental." I said, "No, it isn't." She said, "Why do they do that?" I told her I didn't know. I said, "You could ask Commander Vale." Seville said she was not going to ask Commander Vale that. I said I thought that was probably wise. The question sat in the air between us, and I didn't have an answer for it that wasn't too large to say out loud. At the 3-hour mark, I received a request from Commander Vale. She asked if I was willing to speak directly with Rear Admiral Cale Thorsen, commanding officer of the 9th Armada Group, Black Armada. She said it was not required. She said the Admiral had asked if I was available and had told her to make clear that the work would continue regardless. I told her I was available. The channel shifted. The voice that came through was different from Vale's, lower, somewhat less crisp at the edges. the voice of someone who had spent considerable time in environments where the acoustics are not ideal. He introduced himself simply as Thawsen, not Admiral Thawsen, not Rear Admiral, just Thawsen. I noted this and filed it. He asked me how my passengers were doing. I told him they were improving. I told him the medical team from the Meridian Grace had the situation in hand, and that Tarek had said the oxygen stress indicators were resolving. I thanked him for the medical team. He said, "That's what the Grace is for." I said, "Admiral Thawsen, I owe you an explanation. Our communications officer made a routing error. The beacon was intended for the Coalition emergency band. We did not deliberately access your network." He said, "I know." I said, "You know." He said, "Your routing log was in the structural report you transmitted. The pre-diaspora burst channel header is distinct. We could tell it was a misroute inside the first minute." I said, "And you came anyway." He said, "You had 941 people on a damaged ship." Yes, we came anyway. I said, "That seems like a significant resource commitment for a misrouted civilian beacon." There was a pause, not the short professional pause that Vale had given me. A slightly longer one, the kind that suggests the person on the other end is deciding how to say something they have said before. He said, "Captain Karras, we have the 9th because we built the 9th. We built the 9th because there was a period in our history when nobody came when we sent the beacon. We know what that is. We know what it produces. We run the pre-diaspora channel because anybody who finds it and uses it, accidentally or otherwise, found it because they needed something. The channel is not an accident. The channel is maintained. Your communications officer used it correctly in the sense that matters." I said, "She didn't know she was using it." He said, "It's still the channel she used, still the signal she sent. I've found over a long career that intent matters considerably less than action in emergency situations. Your passengers needed help. You sent a signal. We received it. We came." I did not have an immediate answer for that. Said, "There is a doctrine in the Black Armada that we don't publicize widely because the Conclave finds it difficult to process as anything other than a threat. The doctrine is this: we treat any signal on any frequency we monitor as a valid distress call until we have evidence it is not. The pre-diaspora channel is one of 37 channels we maintain for this reason. Most of them go quiet for years at a time. Some of them have never been used in living memory. We staff them anyway." I said, 37 channels. He said, "Roughly. The number varies as we bring new legacy frequencies back online. It is an ongoing project." I said, "Why?" "In terms that don't involve doctrine." There was a pause that felt like the pause before an honest answer, rather than the pause before a diplomatic one. He said, "Because we spent 2 centuries not being able to afford to monitor anything. And the things that happened in those 2 centuries are in our institutional record in enough detail that the people who run the Black Armada now know exactly what it produces when you can't hear the call. We can afford it now. So we do it." I did not have an immediate answer for that either. He said, "I have a preliminary engineering report from your chief engineer and my team. The hull restoration will be complete in approximately 5.5 hours from now. The Grace's lead medical officer says your passenger complement is stabilizing well, and they expect to have everyone cleared and fully treated within the next 2 hours. We'll hold position until the hull work is certified. After that, you can continue your transit." I said, "I understand, thank you." He said, "Is there anything else your ship needs?" I said, "I believe your teams have been thorough." He said, "They usually are, but ask if there's anything." I said, "Thawsen, may I ask you something?" He said, "Go ahead." I said, "The hospital ship. It has capacity for," Tarek told me, "it has capacity for considerably more patients than we have passengers." He said, "Correct." I said, "You brought it at full capacity?" He said, we didn't know what we were bringing it to. The beacon said 941 souls and a hull breach. That could mean anything. We brought what we had. I said, you didn't scale the response to the information available. He said, we scaled it to the worst plausible case. I said, I stopped. He waited. I said, that's a different calculus than I'm accustomed to. He said, it tends to produce better outcomes. You lose a little efficiency on the cases where you brought more than you needed. You gain a great deal on the cases where you didn't bring enough. I said, what do you do with the resources you don't use? He said, we put them back. The Grace resets. The engineering team packs up. The destroyers refuel and go back on their patrol. The carrier returns to station. Cost of keeping them ready is constant. The marginal cost of one response is lower than it looks. I said, what if you'd needed those resources elsewhere while you were here? He said, then we'd send the next closest group. We have more than one group. I said, how many groups? He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, enough. I accepted that. The whole work was certified at the 5-hour and 20-minute mark, which was slightly ahead of schedule. Brell's assessment of the human engineering team's sealant application system was, by the end of the job, simply good. From Brell, that is a great deal. She has opinions about engineering, and she does not waste them on work she considers mediocre. I asked her, when she filed the final certification, what she thought of working alongside Voss. She said she knows her materials. Then, after a pause, she asked me about our hull alloy composition before she started. I told her. She adjusted the polymer formulation on the spot. She had 6 variants in her kit. She knew which one was correct for our hull inside 5 minutes. I asked what that implied. Brell said that they bring options, they don't assume, they assess and select. Another pause, that's good engineering practice. From Brell, that was the highest commendation I expected to hear in the remaining span of my career. The medical clearance came at the 2-hour 20-minute mark. Every one of my 941 passengers was cleared. The oxygen stress indicators had fully resolved. The 6 passengers with existing respiratory conditions had been treated preventively and were, according to the Grace's lead physician's notation in the handoff summary, in better condition than their pre-transit medical records would have predicted. I noted that and did not know entirely what to do with it. At the 6-hour mark, Commander Vale hailed to tell me that the 9th was prepared to release us to continue transit at my discretion. She transmitted a summary package, engineering certification, medical clearance records, a complete log of every action taken by every member of the 9th's teams while aboard or adjacent to our vessel. The summary package was 37 pages. It had timestamps on every entry. It was the most thoroughly documented 6 hours of my career. She asked if I had any questions about the summary package. I said I did not. She said, "Safe transit, Captain Karras." I thanked her. I thanked the 9th Armada Group. I am aware that thanks offered on a professional channel have a formal quality that does not fully carry what I meant, but the professional channel was what I had. She said, "It's what we do." She had said that before. First time I heard it, it sounded like a deflection. Second time I understood it differently. It was not a deflection. It was a description. This is what they do. They built the apparatus. They staff the channel. They maintain the readiness. And when the channel activates, they respond to the worst plausible case, because the cost of under-response is a thing they have a specific institutional memory of, and the cost of over-response is restocking and a few hours of downtime. This is what they do. It is not exceptional to them. It is the baseline. There is something uncomfortable in that if you think about it too long. It implies that somewhere in the long record of why they built it this way, there is a history of cases where nobody came, where the channel was not open, where the response was proportioned to what the requester appeared to need rather than what they might need, and the gap between those two assessments was the gap in which people died. The architecture of the Ninth Armada Group and the 37 maintained frequencies is not an expression of generosity, or not only that. It is an engineering response to a specific class of failure. They have done the work of knowing what the failure costs. They have decided the cost of preventing it is the correct expenditure. This is not sentiment. This is a group of people who have done the arithmetic and arrived at a conclusion that now has its own momentum. We are the exceptional part. We are exceptional because we sent the beacon and were surprised by what answered. The Ninth broke formation as we moved out on transit heading. The carrier went first, back into transit with the smooth efficiency of a vessel that does this regularly. The hospital ship followed, then two of the destroyers, then the remaining two. They went in sequence and they went cleanly, and the scope cleared, and we were alone in our sector again. Seville stood at the navigator's console and looked at the clear scope for a while. Then she said, "Do you know what I keep thinking about?" I asked her what. She said, "The channel, the pre-diaspora channel. How long has that been running?" I said I didn't know precisely. The pre-diaspora period in Earth's history predates the current conclave structure by several centuries. The channel could be anywhere from 200 to 500 years old, depending on how you dated it. It had been maintained for all of that time. Seville said, 500 years. They maintained a channel for 500 years on the theory that someone might eventually use it. I said, yes. She said, and we did, by accident. I said, yes. She said, and they came. I said, yes. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, I want to know how many other ships have used that channel. I told her I suspected we were not the first. She said, I suspect we're not either. I told her that was a research project for another day. She said, does it bother you? I asked her what she meant. She said, that we got all of that because we sent a signal on the wrong channel. That someone else somewhere sent the right signal on the right channel to the people they were supposed to reach, and maybe didn't get what we got. I thought about that. I said, the Conclave emergency network is functional. The coalition tender would have arrived. She said, in 4 to 8 hours. I said, yes. She said, the Grace cleared all our passengers in 2. The hull is certified. We're 8 hours ahead of where we'd have been. I said, yes. She said, and the failover oscillation was 3 hours from a failure event. I said, yes. She looked at the scope, which was clean now, and said, so it mattered that they came instead. I said, I believe it did. She said, then it's good Orin made the mistake. I thought about that for a while. There is a version of this story in which Orin's mistake is simply a mistake, a routing error, a wrong channel, a cascade of fortunate consequences that we did not engineer and did not deserve. There is another version in which the mistake is incidental, because the real story is that someone maintained a channel for 500 years and answered inside 3 minutes and came to the worst plausible case, and the channel being misrouted to doesn't change any of that. The channel being misrouted to was the point. The channel existing was the point. I don't know which version is the correct framing. I suspect they are both partial descriptions of something that doesn't have a clean frame. What I know is this. Orin Teshali, 26 years old, 31 hours awake, put her hands on a routing table and made a mistake, and 941 people are alive and in good health and on their way to a colony world because of something that was built and maintained and staffed and kept running on the principle that the channel should be open, and the answer should be ready, and the response should be proportioned to the worst plausible case. I filed the incident report with the Conclave Standard Office. I filed it accurately, as I had told Seville I would. The routing error is in the report. The pre-diaspora channel is in the report. The composition of the Ninth Armada Group is in the report. The timeline is in the report. 37 pages of certified engineering and medical records are appended. I don't know what the Conclave Standard Office will do with the report. It will go to someone who has a desk and a mandate to file it, and it will become part of a record that may or may not be read by anyone with the authority to do anything with it. That is how these things go. I am a ship captain. I file the report. What happens to the report is outside my operational scope. What I did separately was write a letter. Not a formal communication, not a diplomatic document, a letter on the ship's general correspondence system addressed to Rear Admiral Cale Thorsen, 9th Armada Group, Black Armada, through the pre-diaspora burst channel, because that was the channel I had. I said that I understood we had reached them by accident. I said that the accident had produced an outcome that I thought deserved more than a standard incident report could carry. I said that I did not know the history behind the channel or the calculus behind maintaining it, but that I had spent the transit hours after our departure thinking about it, and that the thinking kept arriving at the same place. The place was this: there is a version of care that is proportioned to what you think someone needs, and there is a version of care that is proportioned to what they might need, and those two versions produce very different architectures. The first version is efficient. The second version is expensive and results in hospital ships that arrive to situations that do not fill their bay capacity, and engineering teams that carry more sealant than one hull breach requires, and carrier groups that deploy for a civilian colony ship's distress call. The second version is also the version that meant my passengers were alive and healthy and on their way to their new world. I said I thought they should know that the architecture worked. I sent the letter. I do not know if Thorsen read it. I received, 3 days into our resumed transit, a brief response on the burst channel. It was not from Thorsen. It was from Commander Vale. It said only, "He read it, thank you for sending it. Safe transit, Captain Karras." I showed the response to Seville. She read it twice. Then she said, 3 days later and they're still monitoring the channel. I said yes. She said, of course they are. I said yes. She said nothing after that. Neither did I. There was nothing left to say that the channel being open and the answer being ready hadn't already said. We arrived at the colony world on schedule. 9 days later, 941 passengers disembarked. The hull certification held through the entire transit. Tarak's medical log showed no further indicators of oxygen stress in any passenger. The 6 passengers with existing respiratory conditions had, at the time of disembarkation, readings that their pre-transit records had not predicted would be possible this far along in a transit cycle. I stood at the bottom of the disembarkation ramp and watched them go. It is one of those moments that transport captains talk about as the payoff, the reason you do the job. People who packed everything they owned into the aft compartments of your ship, who trusted you with the whole of what comes next for them, walking down the ramp onto ground that is going to be their ground. I had done this before. I have done it since. But standing there, 9 days out from a 6-hour hold in a debris-adjacent sector while a carrier group I had not requested and did not expect worked on our hull and treated my passengers, I was aware of it differently. Aware that it was close. Not as close as I had allowed myself to calculate while we waited. I had kept the calculations private, but the numbers had been in my head. Aware that it was closer than the passengers knew, and that was appropriate, because the captain's job includes knowing what the passengers don't need to know. Dara came past me on the ramp with her 4 children. The youngest, the one under 4, was asleep against Dara's shoulder. Dara caught my eye for a moment. She did not say anything. She gave me the look of a person who knows something happened and has chosen not to ask the full dimensions of what it was, and is making peace with that choice. I gave her the look of a captain who received the question and declined to answer it in full, which is not deception, which is simply the captain's part of the compact. She went down the ramp. Borthas, the retired academic who had asked specific questions about atmospheric processing units, stopped beside me at the bottom of the ramp. He looked at the colony world for a moment. Then he said, "There was a carrier group. I saw it on the external feed in the compartment, before they cut the feed." He said it neutrally, as a statement of fact. I said, "There was a carrier group." He said, "We weren't supposed to need a carrier group." I said, "No." He said, "But it worked out." I said, "It worked out." He looked at me for a moment longer, with the particular curiosity of a person who has spent their career asking questions and knows when they are not going to get the full answer to one. Then he nodded once and went down the ramp. Oren walked past me on her way down the ramp. She was not on duty. We had reached the colony, her shift was done. She was going to see the disembarkation the way the passengers saw it, from the ramp, from the ground. She paused when she reached me. She said, "Captain." I said, "Oren." She said, "I've been thinking about the report." I told her the report was filed and accurate. She said, "I know. I meant I've been thinking about what's in it. The mistake." She looked out at the colony world, which was doing what colony worlds do when you first see them, looking simultaneously vast and immediate, full of the particular quality of potential that only new ground has. She said, "I keep wanting to apologize for it and I don't quite know how, because the outcome was," she stopped. I said, "Good." She said, "Yes, but the mistake was still a mistake." I said, "It was. File that separately from the outcome. The outcome was good. The mistake was a mistake. Both of those things are true and they don't cancel each other." She considered that. Then she said, "Do you think they'd have come for someone else? If someone else had used the channel, by accident like I did?" I said, "I think they built the channel for exactly that question, and I think the answer is yes." She said, That's a big thing to build." I said, "It is." She said, "Why?" I said, "I think you'd have to ask someone who was there when they decided to build it, but my best guess is that the people who built it knew what it cost to not have it." She looked at the colony world for a moment longer. Then she went down the ramp and I watched her go. The unbroken Meridian was certified for its return transit 2 days later. I filed the transit plan with the Conclave Routing Authority. I used the standard coalition emergency band, the correct channel, for all routine communications. But I ran a secondary line, quiet, in the background of our communications array, monitoring the pre-diaspora burst channel. Listening. It costs nothing to listen. The channel carries very little traffic, mostly relay noise, occasional calibration pings from Earth's relay network, the quiet hum of a frequency that has been open and ready for a very long time. I told Oren what I had done. She looked at the secondary display for a moment, then back at me. She said, "Is that standard practice?" I told her I was making it our practice. She said, "What if something comes through?" I told her, "If something comes through, we answer." She said, "We're a colony transport. We're not equipped for." I said, "We answer. We relay. We stay with them until someone with more assets arrives. We can do that much." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Okay." She added the channel to her active monitoring stack. She did not make a log entry about it. It was not required. It was a discretionary decision, and discretionary decisions do not require entries. But she added it to her stack, and she watched it, and I think she will watch it for a long time. I think that is the right answer to the question of what you do when someone spends 500 years building a channel and staffing it, and answering in 3 minutes, and sending a carrier and a hospital ship, and 4 destroyers to a civilian colony transport that reached them by accident. You don't let it be something that happened to you. You make it something you carry. You keep the channel open. You answer,